I want to thank the Faculty Senate, the University Support Staff Senate, and the Unclassified Senate for co-sponsoring today's event. I think as all of you for taking time out of your noon hour to attend. I also want to thank those of you watching online from Kansas City and Wichita and Overland Park, elsewhere. If anybody's in Iceland or Greenland or wherever it is, we appreciate them attending. If those of you watching online have questions, you can email those to chancellor@ku.edu, and we'll either get to them today or we'll get to you after today. The goal is once again to keep you informed about the state's budget situation, how it impacts KU, and how we're responding. And the people that are sitting here with me are the people who've really been on the front lines of this effort, and I think have done a fantastic job in analyzing where we are and what we can do. I think you know them, but I'll read out their names anyway, just so that you can be sure that you do. Provost Richard Lariviere on my left, Kathy Damron, Director of State Relations on my left, Theresa Gordzica, the Chief Financial Officer, and Diane Goddard, the Vice Provost for Finance on the Lawrence campus, also Comptroller. Throughout this whole process that we've been involved with, you've heard me express, I think, many times that KU will weather this storm. People have been in the same kind of situation that we're in this year, and the university they've survived, and the university has survived. If you ever get a chance to read the history of the University of Kansas by Clifford Griffin, he's got a long chapter on the Depression and what happened to KU during the Depression. As a matter of fact, what happened in 1932 and 1933 is pretty instructive. In 1932, the University of Kansas had a 25% budget cut. That was what happened right in the real depths of the Depression. And to show you how, if you think some of the things that we've been talking about and thinking about it seem a little silly, but necessary, it was interesting. In 1932, July 1932, the cost of mailing a first-class letter went up from 2 cents to 3 cents. And the regents advised the university and the faculty that since this was part of the fiscal crisis, first-class mail going up from 2 cents to 3 cents, one way you can save money is if you put 4 or 5 letters in the same envelope. I've always been intrigued by that. I don't understand how you could do that unless you somehow mandate everybody live together so that the information can get spread. But it's an example, I think, of how when you're in a difficult budget situation like this, it's really important that we think about all possibilities. And we've, as you know, we've encouraged you and others to give us your thoughts on how we might save money in this difficult time. We've received more than 100 messages, some of them containing multiple suggestions for ways that we can do a better job in both saving money and stewarding our resources. We've received a number of ideas for reducing energy use. Whether through doing a better job of turning lights and computers off, we would be able to save some money, or through better management of heating and cooling of campus buildings. We've also had people suggest specific programs or services to cut. Fairly seldom is anybody suggest that we cut their job, but there have been some suggestions on jobs that could be thrown into the heat. But I think that's natural enough, and I think everybody has been serious about what we can do in a difficult budget time. What I want to assure you all is that everybody who sent in a suggestion, we're going to make sure that every one of those things gets considered. The provost will be sending and reviewing some of those things to the deans and vice provosts. We've got to do that in order to be effective, I think, in finding a solution that we can all live with. Probably one of the most consistent things that we've been asked about is the whole question of furloughs. I won't go into this now, but I will ask Richard if he could maybe address that and some of the thinking about furloughs as we go forward. The key thing about where we are in terms of the budget is that earlier this week, Governor Sebelius signed the bill making cuts to the current fiscal year 2009. And to talk about those cuts, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Theresa and Diane to talk about fiscal year 2009, and then Kathy, Damron, and Richard will go forward and talk about 2010. So let's start that way, and we'll throw it open to questions and answers at any point. So whatever we're saying, don't hesitate to to raise your hand or just speak out, and so we can have a dialogue, a question and answer period. With that said, Diane?
I'll go first. I'll go first. The last time we met, you may recall, we were looking at a 3% budget reduction. The legislature ended up with a 4.25% budget reduction on both campuses. For the Lawrence campus, that's about a $6.5 million cut, and at the medical center, it's about $5.2 million. There were also a number of things in the bill that was passed that were vetoed. For example, the Wichita Center for Graduate Medical Education, the legislature had recommended and approved an additional $2.9 million in the current year, and the governor did veto that funding. There were some transfers to the Kansas Bioscience Authority that the governor had limited. The legislature increased those limits, and the governor again vetoed the higher increases. Finally, there's a healthcare stabilization fund, which primarily impacts the medical center. The governor had recommended removal of some of the funding there to spend down some balances in the current year. The legislature restored it, but the governor vetoed those funds. So that's what we know about the current fiscal year. Basically, we're looking at a 4.25% budget reduction on both campuses. And I'll turn it over to Diane to talk more about the Lawrence campus and how we're handling things on this campus.
For the Lawrence campus, if you remember last time when we were talking about the 3% cut, we had cut academic units 1% off of their assessable base, and the non-academic units were cut 1.25%. In order to handle the additional 1.25% cut that is now that we're now dealing with, we are simply going to ask both academic and non-academic units to increase their cut for FY09 by 0.5%. So other than that, I don't have any other updates.
You've already sent that out.
It'll probably be going out this afternoon to the budgeteers.
Kathy?
Very good. The legislature, once they had the 09 budget actions behind them and then the subsequent action by the governor earlier this week, started turning their attention in earnest to the next fiscal year's budget. Every month, with continued declining revenues coming in, they are exercising a great deal of caution in building next year's budgets. So they're going forward knowing that there will in fact be stimulus dollars coming from DC, but they're not assuming that the budgeting decisions they're making now can be affected by them. Hopefully by the time the session adjourns, we'll have a truing up of those two financial forces. But for now, it looks as though the House and Senate will try to enact budget assumptions of about 10% reduced spending for all agencies, higher education, SRS, corrections, every state agency that is dependent on state general fund dollars. So that's where we're headed. It looks as though we won't know anything final about the budget, even on a preliminary basis. In years past, they've done a preliminary budget and then have adjourned and come back for a veto session in late April and done an omnibus budget or a wrap-up budget. It looks like this year they may wait and just do all of their spending decisions for next year in one mega budget at the very end. So take a deep breath. I think you can assume that it'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of an additional 10%. While all of those decisions are being made by Appropriations and Ways and Means committees, there are policy decisions being made by the other committees of the legislature, and they are trying to find ways in which they can allow the universities and other state agencies to be able to deliver services in the way that they want us all to be able to serve the public. To do more with less. And so there are a number of legislative initiatives that the university and the Board of Regents have put on the legislative agenda that are moving through the process quite well. So we're encouraged by those actions. Some of the specifics of those can be found on our website, and I'd be happy to go into the details of those if you have questions about those when we get to the question and answer. Richard?
Thank you, Kathy. I think it's useful. It has been, at least for me, to kind of just step back a little bit and recognize that exactly what's happening to us here. There are many of us in this room who were either students or working at universities public universities, when the state picked up 80 and 90% of the operating costs. Almost all of us are intimately familiar with the fact that now in Kansas, for example, the operating costs are paid for about 23% by the legislature. And Kansas is in much better shape than many of our other states. What we've seen over the last 50 years is the state, you and I, as taxpayers, walking away from the responsibility, the obligation, the bill of paying for public higher education. Since that has been happening at the rate of 2 or 3% per year, it's possible for an institution like this to adapt, not always successfully, but to adapt nonetheless. What we're looking at this year and next year is a really dramatic acceleration of that process. And because it's so accelerated, it's not possible for us to adapt in the normal manner that we would do. A combination of donations, external grant funding, increases in tuition, et cetera. None of those options is going to be adequate to deal with a one-time sudden hit of as Kathy said, as much as 15% or perhaps even more. What that means is that we will have to make some really dramatic adjustments of a sort that many of us in our working careers have not had to make. So that's the macro issue. The shorter term issue is how do we deal with this? How do we cope with it? Universities are about 12 months out of sync with the rest of the economy in terms of how we respond to economic vicissitudes. When things get really, really good, we don't get the benefit for, well, maybe ever, but certainly not for a year. And when things make a downturn, we also don't have the immediate impact that the rest of the economy may have. And that has to do with the nature of what it is the way we run our operation. We have a 9-month teaching schedule. We often have 1-year contracts with people. So we're a little bit out of sync with what's actually being visited upon us. So what that means is that if we have a 15% budget cut or so in the 2010 budget, we are going to have to reduce key components of our services and our operation at a level and at a scale that is really going to be painful. Now, we can't just turn the switch and reduce our budgets. What we have to do is accommodate budgetary needs on the short term with one-time money so that we can phase in fundamental reductions over a longer term. We've already done that this year. The 4.25% that we have had to cut out of this year's budget, we didn't do that by saying that we're going to reduce the number of courses that we're offering or that we're going to cut down on the number of advisors, et cetera. We've done that by identifying one-time money that we can give back to the state. But then next year, in next year's budget, we have to not do that with one-time money, but with permanent reductions. So that's how we will phase in these cuts, not with permanent cuts immediately, but by identifying ways that we can identify large chunks of one-time money and phase in the cuts. Now, one of the key ways that we will probably have to do this is through furloughs. And furloughs, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, is a notion where you simply say to an employee, we can't pay your full salary this year. And so what we're asking you to do is stay home for 1 day or 2 days, or in some cases, some of our colleagues have seen furloughs of as long as 2 weeks, in which you simply aren't paid. You still have a job, your salary is still X, but we are not going to pay your salary for some period of time. I really would love not to have to resort to this sort of technique, but it is very likely that we will have to next year. We're looking at a variety of plans, the details of which we're still working them out. But I can tell you the broad strokes of this will be that we intend to hold harmless those members of our community whose salaries are at the lowest end of the range. And I don't want to get into specifics yet because we haven't finished working on those models. And we intend to visit the longest term furloughs on those people who are at the upper end of our salary ranges. So, for example, and then please don't take this as a specific plan, but if someone were to make, say, less than $30,000 or $25,000 or whatever the models require, those people would probably not have any furloughs. Those people at the top end of the salary ranges would probably have the longest period of furloughs. Those people in the middle range would have shorter furloughs. In other words, we would have this be as progressive a system as possible and still achieve the reduction in costs such that we could return to the state the cuts that are going to be visited upon us. Now, we won't do all of the cuts on the backs of furloughs. We will cut. We are cutting everywhere that we possibly can that does not visit this punishment, this pain on our staff and on our faculty. But keep in mind that about 80 cents out of every dollar that this university spends is on people. So we will inevitably have to have some kinds of, we will feel collectively, all of us, some form of this visited upon us individually. And no one hates this more than the group that are sitting here in front of you. But, you know, we are where we are, and we have to protect, we absolutely must protect the integrity of the operation of this marvelous institution. And in order to do that, we have to visit some amount of difficulty on the very people who are this marvelous institution, who make it possible, and that's the people in this room and the people watching this broadcast. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
How will that affect benefits? If a person's on furlough, will they still be full-time, or vacation be paid, or, I mean, their insurance, how does that affect benefits?
The question is, how would a furlough affect benefits? And that's a very good question. My weasel answer to that is we don't know for sure, but I will tell you that we have had proposals, as we should have, because we want every idea that anybody can generate to cope with this. We have had proposals that would affect people's benefits. For example, there has been a proposal to reduce or eliminate contributions to retirements, et cetera. I'm very much against that, that sort of thing. And the reason that I'm against it is that if we reduce someone's salary by 8.5% for 1 year, they've lost 8.5% for 1 year. If we reduce their contribution, which is 8.5% to their retirement, they have lost not just that initial investment, but all of the accumulated benefits for the rest of their career. And that's a very high price to pay, and it's a hidden price because you don't feel it immediately. We're very well aware that the benefits that this university offers, while they're not as good as they might be, are really essential to people's well-being, and we're going to protect those as aggressively as we possibly can.
Health insurance, those contributions will still be made, so they
Yes, ma'am. Right. Yes.
How will staff who are 100% grant funded be affected by this?
That's a great question. For those of you who didn't hear, how will staff who are 100% grant funded be affected by this? We really have to be as equitable as we possibly can here, and we do have situations where two people side by side at a bench doing more or less identical work, one is funded through this source and one is funded through that source. We are working very hard, and this is part of the incredible complication that our finance people have been dealing with, to put all of the eggs in the basket and figure out how to deal with this problem. It is not going to be the case that if you are funded by 100% funded by non-state sources that you'll escape the difficulty here. Nor is it the case that if you are funded by 100% by state sources that you're going to have to bear all the burden yourself. We really want to mitigate this by making this as broadly based as possible, but also as equitable as possible.
Hi, I do the budget and payroll for the registrar's office, and are we safe for the rest of the year from not getting our salaries? That was the big question in our office, and then the other question is if they're not getting paid, do they have to come to work?
Well, first of all, you're welcome for your salary this Friday. We don't think that that our paychecks are really going to be vulnerable. We wanted to stay out of that cat fight as much as possible between the factions in Topeka, so we really didn't want to say very much out loud about it. We were never terribly worried that we weren't going to get paid this Friday. That was some high drama that was unavoidable probably, but we didn't want to be part of that, so we didn't want to get out in front of it. And I wanted to, actually had drafted a message reassuring the community that there would be paychecks on Friday, but it really looked like we were taking sides in the fight when we said that. So I don't think we're going to see that happen again. If you're not being paid, can you stay home? Must you stay home? We've got some fair labor standards issues that we've got to attend to and that we will advise supervisors about. I can tell you that with regard to me personally, I'm going to be here. We've got work to do. And I owe it to you to be here.
We have an email question. It's kind of regarding the effect of the overall economy on students, and specifically, have we seen any decrease in applications for next year, and then also what impact will there be on student aid for students coming in?
Those are really great questions. Thank you. Whoever sent it in, thank you for that. Right now, we are running at almost exactly the same rate of application and deposits that we were last year when we broke the record for our enrollments. So it looks like our enrollments are going to be either at or exceed record levels again next year. We have had a dramatic downturn in the value of our endowments, as anyone who reads the newspaper probably knows. This has an effect on the ability to offer scholarships, because many of our scholarships are endowed. Most of them are endowed. We will see for the next 2 years at the University of Kansas a significant decline in the amount of money we have to offer to students, really significant in some cases. We're working very hard to remedy a small part of this with some legislative relief that Kathy alluded to. We're a long way from having that actually passed into law, but the prospects look better than any of us had a right to hope, I think, going into this. So we're working really hard to address this. There is relief at the federal level. The Pell Grants, for example, are going up to nearly $5,000 next year, which is a pretty significant increase. So at the lowest end of the socioeconomic spectrum, there will be some significant relief. It's the middle class that's going to have the most significant impact next year.
I might just add that there's also in the stimulus package, there will be double the number of Pell Grants that there were previously. So not only has it gone up in terms of amount, it's gone up in terms of number of Pell Grants also.
Has it been determined that before the furloughs that anyone like USS or faculty or anyone would get a pay raise, and then you would later on cut that amount when you implement a furlough? For instance, USS broke away and were, no longer classified. Is there any kind of letter that anybody's going to get, or notice that there are 0 pay raises at all this year?
Well, that's a really good question. As you know, the governor allowed for a 1% salary increase for state employees, but didn't provide any money in her budget for it, which is tantamount to simply saying that if you can find the money, go ahead and give someone a 1% salary increase. We haven't finally resolved that question, but I will tell you that it's very, very, very unlikely that we will see any salary increases here other than those kinds of one-off, unique situations where an individual is absolutely crucial to the operation and they've just got an offer they can't walk away from. We are not freezing salaries, nor are we freezing hiring, because those really almost never work. There's always a circumstance in an operation as complex as this where you simply have to replace someone who has retired or has left the university, or you simply have to match a market offer to keep a crucial person. But it's going to be a very, very thin year. This, as you know, we have already kept vacant 110 positions here that we would have filled, and we have notified 11 of our colleagues that they will not be rehired next year. So we're already, and keep in mind those 110 vacant positions are not they're not luxuries that we can do without. What we're essentially saying to to this entire community is that there's 110 people whose work will have to be done by all the rest of us next year, faculty and staff.
I've been trying to follow your comments about furloughs. I thought early on you said that the old idea of furlough was that you don't get paid for a while and you don't work for a while. But more recently, I thought you were saying that basically what that furlough would mean is you just get paid less, but we expect you to work your usual. Is that right?
Thank you for pointing out my confusing message there. We don't know exactly how a furlough will work yet. A lot of this will be determined by federal law. If one is not paid, you're not obliged to be here, it seems to me. On the other hand, having said that, I know this community well enough to know that if we are in a furlough situation, that you, for example, are not going to say to your students, I'm not going to be here on Wednesday. That's the character of this community. And in either case, what we're talking about is a reduction in salary. Now, one of the things about furloughs that appeals to me over pay cuts is that my sense of the salary levels in this community of the University of Kansas is that we're already behind the curve in terms of a comparison with our peer group. And a furlough is not a pay cut. Your salary is still X, it's just that we're not going to pay it to you. Now, that's a one-time reduction, and that's not going to solve our permanent cut problem. So we may have to go to pay cuts at some point to solve this problem. But I want to make that one of the last options on the table, because what that does, we're going to get out of this downturn. The Kansas economy, the U.S. economy is going to get out of it, and KU is going to be here and just as strong as ever. But I don't want us to come out of this in a condition that puts us at a huge competitive disadvantage. So pay cuts are a really low item on my priority list at this moment. Not a permanent pay cut, no. A furlough is not a permanent pay cut.
I would just like to ask, are the furloughs only going to apply to staff, or are they also going to apply to administrators and faculty?
The models, the question is, will furloughs apply only to staff, or will they apply to administrators and to faculty? The models that we've been looking at apply to everyone.
This may be for Kathy, but the Kansas Board of Regents has given scholarships before for those students who have given military service and for the National Guard. Is there any chance those are not going to be funded this year?
That has not been anything that they have discussed doing away with at this point.
Yes.
Do you anticipate
anticipate a time when the suggestions you've received would be made public to the university community or beyond, whether or not you're going to implement them, just so that people know what's being talked about by their peers?
That's a good question. Are they not now available? They're not. Okay. Yeah, we should absolutely do that. That's a very good suggestion. What we are doing with the suggestions is, on a daily basis, we distribute them to all deans and vice provosts across the board. Every suggestion, whether it is germane to their respective operations or not. sometimes people have good ideas for one segment of the community that could be applied to others. They have been of pretty high quality, these suggestions. There's one or two people who think that we could solve this problem if they could park closer to their offices.
For input, and I know that's very valuable, as you just mentioned. I'm curious if you're fully satisfied with the kind of communications and transparency that staff and faculty would like to see. How would you rate that in terms of these kinds of forums are very valuable, but are you getting enough input, and do you feel that the Senates, for example, are active in dialogue with you?
Well, speaking for myself, I think I've done a marvelous job of being, no, just kidding. We really want as much feedback as we can possibly get. We are in constant communication with the Senates on this on these issues. Part of the problem that we have faced is, and we still face, is that until very recently, we didn't even know what the budget was for '09. And so all we could say to anybody was, we're going to have some cuts. That doesn't do much in terms of engendering enthusiasm and optimism and confidence. So you don't want to just keep saying we're going to have cuts, because the question was, how much? And we just didn't know. And unfortunately, we're in exactly that situation now with the 2010 budget. It could be 7%, or 7.25%. That's what the governor's model has indicated. It could be 20%. It could be 25%. The best estimates that the clairvoyants have mustered for us is something around 15%. We're trying to tell people to get ready for something like that without pulling the trigger and saying it's going to be 15%, because we just don't know. Having said all of that, we need to put in place, and we have actually begun the process of putting in place a blue ribbon task force that will represent as broadly as possible, without being unmanageably large, all of the operations of this university. And the finance people, Theresa and Diane's people, have done yeoman's work, and still are doing it, to identify a variety of levers that we would pull to reduce our budget, state budget, by $22 million, which is what 15% would mean. If you pull this lever, you get $1 million. If you pull that lever, you get $3 million, et cetera, et cetera. But just identifying where the money would come from when you pull the lever is just the beginning of the conversation. Because if you pull this lever and save $1 million, the consequences for the whole community may be devastating. So we don't want to pull that lever. But thinking about the ripple effect of these cuts is really challenging in an operation as complex as this one. And that's why at this stage now, where we've begun to identify what the levers are that will generate money, we now need a group of people who represent all of the operations of this place as well as we possibly can, to say, all right, now you tell us, if we pull this lever, what are going to be the consequences? Not that they're going to determine that that's the lever we pull, but we need that feedback. We need someone to tell us that doing that is going to be really harmful to this operation, even though you may not have seen the connection. And at the end of that process, and it won't be a long process because we're not going to have a lot of time, at the end of that process, we will have a better perspective, I think, on the consequences of any single decision. And that will help us make the final choices.
We have
Your question is a little bit like, have you stopped beating your transparency? I think the point that I would make about that, I think I can speak for everybody that's sitting here. If you are the judge of whether or not we have been successful in the communication. I mean, we've done this event and we've done other events, and we've certainly been open to. I mean, many of us have had people sending us email and messages of one sort or another. You are the judge of whether or not we're being satisfactorily communicative. That's our goal. That's what our aim is going to continue to be. We'll have other examples like this, and as well as other ways of making this process as transparent as possible. But there should be no doubt whatsoever about what our goal is here, and that is to achieve the kind of transparency, the level of transparency that you feel serves you as a member of this community.
Well, I'm always interested in who's at the table. You know, things don't always go in the way one individual or one program would like, but a unit would care to see. But if enough people are at the table, I think that's a satisfactory sense of empowerment and dialogue. So I appreciate you saying that.
Well, I've noticed in 15 years at KU that people tend to want to be at the table and are frequently successful in achieving that end.
Yes, I read that recently the Board of Regents authorized the university to negotiate buyout deals for employees who are getting close to retirement. I was wondering whether this is an option that you're looking at. Has anybody applied for this? Would this save a lot of money by getting employees out of the workforce that way?
Yes, the question is, are we looking at retirements as a component of addressing this issue? The short answer to that is yes, we are. But some of you may have noticed that the economy has taken a turn that is not absolutely conducive to retirement at this point. Just to give you some sense of the scale of the phenomenon, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences would ordinarily have somewhere between 35 and 37 faculty retirements every year. This year they have 12.
This question about the furloughs. If we were experiencing furloughs next year, would we have a window where, like, if I knew that I had to take a week off, would I be able to pick that week, or would it be mandated by Diane, Goddard, or that group to say, this is the week that across the board KU is taking a furlough week?
Well, I sure don't want Diane Goddard telling me when I'm going to work. The models that we've looked at have been a designation of number of days. So you may have 3 days that you have to take off in this fiscal year, with the cumulative effect that we have that much reduction in expenditure. Right? And this gives people the optimum set of options for the minimum impact on their jobs or the best time for their families or whatever.
We have another email question. Will the furloughs apply to students of all these categories, GTAs, GRAs, and student hourlies?
As of right now, none of our models include those categories. Right? I think that this is an indication of remarkable transparency if there are no questions, don't you?
Thank you very much for coming. Bob, go ahead.
I'm not sure I heard where you came out on that retirement question. Since there were a lot fewer who retired this year, is that going to increase some pressure for people to retire next year?
Well, what do you mean by pressure?
Well, Well, there are many ways that pressure can be applied.
Let me count the ways. Would you count the ways for me? I don't know what pressure we can bring on people to retire.
Oh, well, I'm not going to give you one. But I think this is a fairly widespread concern in the faculty, among others. And I just wondered, how seriously are you looking at it? And could people who certainly are at what some would consider retirement age expect to receive some kind of pressure to do that? And will someone be working on ways to do that pressure?
Well, I'm not kidding now. I really don't know what you mean by pressure. I don't. Do you have some suggestions?
Well, another way to put it, maybe offer incentives instead of putting pressure.
Well, we do have we have some modest flexibility now with regards to carrying benefits for a period of time, and perhaps Ola could speak to that. But we don't bring pressure to bear on people to retire. I mean, maybe colleagues in your department do, and if that's the case, we probably need to have some legal counsel brought in. But that's really a personal decision that's made by the individual. And it's true that in normal times, if people are hesitant to retire for one reason or another, but would like to, if we have incentives that we can bring to bear, universities, particularly universities with 401ks instead of defined benefits, have very limited options in that regard. We have now the ability to pay for some health care, for example, for a period of time that we didn't have before, but it's a pretty modest set of incentives. And I would certainly not describe it in any measure as pressure. We don't do what you see sometimes in the private sector of big buyouts. We don't have that capacity to do that and put it on the table for a limited time, so either you retire today or you'll never get this buyout again. We simply don't have that array of options available to us. And those institutions that have had them and have done them have regretted it almost uniformly. The University of California is a perfect example of that. They paid big bucks to their best teachers and researchers to go take jobs at the University of Texas. And that's exactly what happened.
The University of Massachusetts did a program like that a few years ago and ended up with something like a net reduction of 35 or 40 faculty, and they had to go out and hire new faculty because the people had vacated their existing jobs. I mean, Richard's point I think is very well taken. There aren't. I can't think of any university that's gone through some kind of a organized buyout effort that was felt that was a good solution for that institution.
We have two email questions, both regarding furloughs. One is, will furloughs apply to people getting disability payments in addition to those of us who are working? And then the second one is a furloughed employee exempted from restrictions on outside employment during the period of the furlough?
Those are good questions. With regard to the latter one, I don't think there would be any restriction on outside employment, but we're also not thinking of such lengthy periods of time that you could say go to Arizona and take a new job while you're on furlough. We're looking at relatively short windows, ranging from 0 to a couple of days to a couple of weeks at the most. With regard to disability benefits, I don't think that would have, the furloughs would have any effect on those payments. I mean, Ola is shaking her head, so I went out on a limb and said no and was lucky enough that I was right.
I'm a little confused. I'm not sure if this is on, but I'm not clear. Are these furloughs that we're talking about for this fiscal year, this next part of the question is, you said Diane Goddard would be looking at things for 2010 when we know, and then you're talking about all the levers that could be pulled. So my understanding is we haven't even reached the discussion of 2010 and which levers you might pull. And so these furloughs are for this year?
No.
No.
This year's budget we have taken care of, as it were. We're talking about 2010.
So furloughs are a part of the whole thing, which could mean discontinuance of programs, could be faculty layoffs, could be what else?
Reductions in services. We're looking at modifying things that are relatively technical. So, for example, auxiliary enterprises, the dormitories, the union, etc. We handle, the university centrally handles the accounting for all of those enterprises. And we currently charge something like 2% to cover our costs for that accounting service. I mean, it's more than accounting, but you get the point. I've asked Theresa and Diane to look at those real costs to see if they really are, if 2% really covers it. It probably doesn't. We're looking at raising those charges, which will then be passed on to the union operation, to the dormitories, to athletics, et cetera. Because that's a hidden subsidy to all of those operations, and we're really trying to recoup that centrally so that we have to have fewer layoffs and less furlough, et cetera. We're looking at everything that we can imagine, every lever we can possibly imagine to pull to avoid having to reduce the central and most important component of what it is that we do, which is our people.
We thank you very much. And if you have additional questions you want to ask any of us in private or personally, feel free to do so. We'll stay around for a while.